Welcome to the China in the World podcast, a series of discussions examining China's foreign policy and shifting engagement with the world. The China in the World podcast is brought to you by Carnegie China and hosted by me, Paul Haenle. Welcome back to Carnegie China's China in the World podcast. I'm delighted today to welcome Sharon Seah to discuss ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute's 2023 State of Southeast Asia Survey. Sharon Seah is a senior fellow and coordinator of both the ASEAN Studies Centre and Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. She's also the lead author of the State of Southeast Asia Survey report, which we'll discuss today, and the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey. Prior to academia, Sharon spent 15 years in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the National Environmental Agency of Singapore. Her research interests include ASEAN, multilateralism, rule of law, and climate change. 2018, she graduated with a Master in Public and International Law from the University of Melbourne, and is also co-editor of 50 Years of ASEAN in Singapore and editor of Building a New Legal Order for the Oceans for Tommy Coe. Sharon, it was nice to meet you in person recently at the recent ICS workshop on the war in Ukraine. And thank you so much for joining our podcast today.
Thank you for having me on, Paul.
I've enjoyed reading the State of Southeast Asia survey over the years to gain insights into regional perspectives, regional views on the outlook for the Southeast Asia, local developments, and even the impact on U.S.-China rivalry, which is where I spend most of my time looking at. To start off, I wonder if you could just give our listeners, because our listeners are, as we've discussed before starting the podcast, our listeners come from an international base with our, several Carnegie global centers around the world. And it would be good for you to just explain a little bit about the State of the Southeast Asia survey. When was it started? What was the objective? Who are the respondents? And what's the aim of the survey in your view?
Most certainly, Paul. This survey was started in 2019. And so this year is the fifth year that we're doing the survey. And really the aim is to try to give a snapshot of the prevailing attitudes towards, some of the international affairs that's happening in this neighborhood, and how Southeast Asians view their dialogue partners and how dialogue partners have engaged with the region over the past year. Of course, it's not meant to be a definitive view of the issues in the region, but it gives you an idea of how people think about this. And it's also a survey of a rather thin segment of the population. These are people we call opinion leaders or policymakers, people who are in a position to inform or influence policy. We offer this survey to 5 affiliation groups: opinion leaders, policymakers, business and finance sector people, academia, CSOs, and so on. And in this year's survey, we've polled 1,308 respondents from all 10 ASEAN member states. We have not included Timor-Leste. It's still not a member of ASEAN, but we get respondents from across the different age groups as well.
Well, that's terrific. And, one of the things I've learned in being here in Singapore over the last year and a half, ASEAN is a bloc. But of course, as you say, there's 10 countries and there's very different and unique perspectives in each of those countries. So this seems like quite a challenging effort. So my hat's off to you and your team for pulling something like this off. This year's survey, it seems like it could have been unique for a number of reasons, not least of which is, the world seems to be recovering to a large degree from COVID-19, from the pandemic. We've got global inflation as an issue, a lot of concern about food and energy security. Of course, the outbreak of the war in Ukraine in February last year, 2022. So I want to just ask, what were the key findings in this year's survey that may have differed to previous years, given those unique set of issues that we've been dealing with over the last year. In other words, what findings surprised you the most in this year's surveys and may have been different than previous surveys?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for that. This year, I think the really top of mind issues for our respondents are bread and butter issues. And you will see in the survey that the top concerns for Southeast Asia is actually unemployment and economic recession. Because when we took the survey last year, starting in November till the end of the year, the headlines were mostly about, inflationary pressures being sustained, the food and energy security issues that were triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war. And these are some of the things that came up top of mind. Whereas in the past 2 years, the threat of COVID-19 to health was the top concern. What really surprised me in this year's survey was that even though, the region has always cast an eye on China and an eye on the US, and a lot of these issues tend to come in this prism of a US-China rivalry. And we've always polled our respondents on how they feel towards China's economic and political influence. And one of the findings that I found surprising was that even though the worry over China's influence has always been present, actually that level of concern has decreased this year, whereas in the past it has always increased. So that shows that maybe the needle is moving, and where people had been wary, they are a little bit more embracing of the kind of political influence that China has in this region. The second finding that was interesting to me was that the trust perceptions of India, which has been very, very low over the past years, has suddenly increased. So India is geopolitically, seen as a bit of a laggard in this region, but it suddenly emerged as the region's third choice for a hedging partner and overtaking Australia for the first time. Australia has always been active in this region, and even more so in the past few years, as we begin to talk about the concept of an Indo-Pacific, and clearly Australia is a big player there. So this is a bit of a surprise for me.
Third choice for a hedging partner behind who's in number 1 and number 2?
EU and Japan. Those are the traditional favorite choices for Southeast Asia.
Interesting.
It hasn't changed for the last 4 years.
Very interesting. Well, I do want to talk to you more about the U.S.-China rivalry. And you mentioned the changes with regard to China in the survey, and we can talk about that a little bit further down. But I wanted to get a sense of, what the survey brought out in terms of the top challenges facing Southeast Asia. It's a rapidly changing region. Many, see it having a sort of a bright socioeconomic future, but at the same time, number of challenges in the near term. You've mentioned some of those. You've got climate and environmental insecurity, geopolitical tensions, humanitarian crisis in Myanmar. What do the survey respondents see as the top challenges facing Southeast Asia? And do you expect these challenges to shift going forward as COVID becomes less of an issue for many governments in the region?
Yeah, I think COVID is pretty much receded to the back of our minds by now, Paul. In Asia, it's a good thing, right? I mean, we're pretty much back to normalcy with face-to-face meetings, travel, the diplomats are meeting each other. We're carrying out our bilateral visits and holding multilateral meetings in person. That's all good. So as I mentioned earlier, unemployment and economic recession was top choice. But at second rank, which is very interesting, was the idea that social economic income gaps, income disparity is becoming a big concern. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that the region suffered through 3 years of basically an economic shutdown. And there are now these issues, and people were losing their jobs and their livelihoods. And now people are coming back up again. But that's left a gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And that's a big problem for the governments in the region. And tied at this second place ranking is the concerns with increased military tensions in the region, specifically in relation to the tensions over Taiwan and the DPRK's defense moves. Let's say the constant firing of ballistic missiles. In fact, another one had been fired yesterday, I saw on the news, and in response to the Japan-Korea summit. So these issues are really coming to the fore. And I think the concerns over Taiwan was really triggered, by that high-profile visit by the former U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the island. And that resulted in a blockade around the island. And this caused, shivers running down spines here in the region. And it's not something that we want to see repeated. Yes. The third rank concern is climate change, as you mentioned, and this has always been a constant. In a separate climate survey that I do as well for the Institute, these concerns are elevated across the region, especially for the Philippines and Vietnam, because they tend to bear the brunt of most of the typhoons and cyclones that's coming this way. So I would say, as countries get back to normalcy and as we encounter, and unless we encounter a new variant or a different type of outbreak, I think these types of challenges will continue to be top of mind. And these challenges are very, very linked to the war in Ukraine.
Yes, and delighted to hear you say, moving beyond COVID, that's music to everyone's ears. But these issues, unemployment, economic recession, income disparity, military tension, climate change, these are significant challenges. And as you say, the war in Ukraine has implications for many of those. I do want to shift gears a bit to ASEAN as an institution, as an organization, because I know this is something the survey looks at as well. It's often given credit for its ability to promote stability in Southeast Asia through consultation and dialogue. But at the same time, ASEAN as an institution does as well face criticism for being too slow sometimes to form consensus, to act on international challenges in a timely manner or an effective manner. And I think Myanmar would be a good example there. What are the top three concerns that regional countries from your survey have about ASEAN as an institution? And how do you expect the chairmanship led by Indonesia this year to have impact these concerns, for better or worse?
Yeah, we actually started the survey because we wanted to know how our community viewed ASEAN. And sad to say, ASEAN is not viewed in very positive light, even by those of us who are proponents and champions of ASEAN. Sometimes ASEAN does frustrate us to a great extent. And the biggest complaint in the survey this year is that ASEAN is slow and ineffective. It is seen as a laggard in responding to crises, including internal ones like Myanmar, and in responding to global problems such as the Ukraine war. The region does not think that ASEAN can cope with these developments. And as you know, Paul, these developments happen at breakneck speed now. It almost seems that after COVID, everything's just compressed into very short timelines. And the way ASEAN has responded or not responded in a timely manner worries people that it will become irrelevant in the new world order. The second concern that we have is, or rather our respondents have, is that the members of ASEAN may become proxies for major powers and that the region become an arena for competition. And that is not unwarranted because there has been, certain members leaning more towards one side or rather than the other. The third concern is with ASEAN's own disunity, and that's becoming a little bit more pronounced now over particular issues like Myanmar, where they can't seem to come to an agreement as to how to implement the 5-point consensus. Now, Indonesia, we started the year with great hopes because Indonesia is a de facto leader of ASEAN, biggest country, biggest economy, and of course, holds certain values that ASEAN champions. Indonesia, I see it will try to bridge that divide, the disunited positions within ASEAN. And I see that President Jokowi, for instance, was here in town yesterday, had a great meeting with Prime Minister Lee. I think he's going to be making more of these outreach to the different ASEAN member states to try to find common ground and consensus. Indonesia as well cares for ASEAN, and the ASEAN Secretariat is based in Jakarta, of course, as you know.
Right.
And they've always been one of the chairs that would take an opportunity to try to strengthen ASEAN's institutional capacities. So I think that would be something that's good for the Secretariat to improve processes, capacities to try to make ASEAN, respond a little faster and put out better responses in that regard. Yeah.
Well, ASEAN's gotten good credit for their role in hosting the G20 last year, and so maybe they can take some of that momentum into the ASEAN chairmanship and help to improve the capacity of the institution. And you've highlighted, some real concerns about relevance going forward, and members of ASEAN becoming proxies. The geopolitical context with which ASEAN has to operate and as a region of competition between major powers. And of course, the disunity that we see at times, which then has an impact on the degree to which it can be effective. And these are considerable challenges. I want to shift to China rivalry. You've mentioned China in the survey and the changes that you saw this year. U.S.-China rivalry as part of that geopolitical major power competition aspect is becoming a significant challenge here in the region. You've referred to that a number of times. I noted in the survey, in line with the trend from previous surveys, that respondents continue to favor enhancing ASEAN's resilience and unity in order to fend off pressure from the two major powers. And that is in contrast to other options like choosing sides, which we hear quite loudly. The region is not interested in choosing sides between the United States and China, or seeking third parties to broaden its strategic space. So apart from promoting economic multilateralism, such as through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, RCEP, what are some other ways through which ASEAN could enhance resilience and unity in this regard?
Yes. So you're right. We asked the question, if ASEAN were caught in a crossfire between Beijing and Washington, how should ASEAN respond, right? And consistently over the past 4 years that we've asked this question, the choice has always been that we should enhance our own resilience and unity. And I think to do that, the first order of the day is to bridge the divide of opinions, whether it's real or perceived division of opinions. We have to bridge it and to make sure that ASEAN comes up with at least a facade of unity. And amongst the many issues, the one that I mentioned earlier was Myanmar. How do you approach Myanmar? How do you ensure that? How do you get everyone to the table to begin discussions? How do you start talking about the talks? I think that's important. So that's the internal one. And the other is when issues come up, Ukraine, Taiwan, these issues need to be discussed. I think as Bilahari Kausikan said in a workshop, we have to have this kind of heart-to-heart talk among the leaders and among the policymakers, and to think about the kind of responses that ASEAN can come to. Another way is to increase the regional economic integration process. I think the pandemic has taken attention off regional economic integration projects because governments have become a little bit more preoccupied with recovering from the pandemic. That's understandable. But also, as I mentioned, the pandemic accelerated so many things, right? Including digitalization. And now new areas are coming up, such as green transition. So these issues will come up and take the mind share of economic integration. But we mustn't take our eyes off the prize. We want to get to an integrated market of 650 million people, and that's what we need to work towards. So keep the noses to the grind, keep at it, especially with a potential new member coming on board, Timor-Leste. So the work of integrating Timor-Leste into ASEAN economically and politically will become even more important. And I think that in this survey, we also asked a question about the admission of Timor. And to my surprise, there's a sense of optimism that integrating Timor will in fact help ASEAN and could in fact enhance ASEAN's resilience and unity rather than to divide it.
That's interesting. My friend Robin Hu now is the non-resident ambassador there, and I'll make sure that he hears this podcast because he'd be very interested in those findings. I'm sure. You wrote a contribution to China File recently, Asia Society's China File, and in that piece you mentioned that ASEAN leaders are unlikely to subscribe to China's new global security initiative and global development initiative, especially if it leads to a loss of autonomy and independence for their own foreign policy priorities. So moving beyond the survey a little bit, I did want to ask you about this because I found it interesting, and we focus quite a bit at Carnegie China on these China-related issues: Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, now the Global Civilization Initiative. Number of initiatives coming out here proposed by the Chinese leadership to offer Chinese solutions to global security and development and other issues. And so in light of your article, your contribution to China File, what do you think China needs to do to convince ASEAN countries to, join these initiatives or to support these initiatives, or at least not push back on these initiatives? And how will these initiatives impact the power balance, in your view, between the U.S. and China, if, they were to be successful?
I think for this region, anything that would force them to take a side is not welcome. So be it the US, be it China knocking on the doors to ask the region to take their offerings, that response will be the same. And we saw this when AUKUS was announced 2 years ago, was it? The reception was not that great. It was cold, in fact. And it was seen as a way to, force sides. In the same way, the Global Security Initiative, it's been met, I would say, with kind of a polite reception. Of course, I think the leaders will be quite wary that they might have to trade in something in order to get Chinese security guarantees. And the question is, what would that trade be? The fear has always been, and it's also shown up in parts of the survey, that tools that are used to coerce or to cause a loss of autonomy and independence are always there. So China needs to address this. And despite what China has done in the region for decades, building infrastructure, bringing the BRI here, I think that China's soft power is still relatively low. And this is something that, perhaps Chinese policymakers can, give a think about how to improve that. Because, all of that hard infrastructure, all of the benefits hasn't really translated to an equal increase in soft power. So that's I think, how will it impact the power balance? I think it will continue to be in this state of push and pull. The tensions, the dynamics would just keep evolving, and it won't make it easier. So I think that tightrope that ASEAN has to walk is only going to get shorter.
Well, these are tremendous, tremendously helpful perspectives, and your insights into the region's views and perspectives on these is really terrific. I wanted to ask one more question, really moving far from the survey now. But while I have you here and you have such tremendous insight into regional perspectives, just want to bring up one recent incident between the U.S. and get a sense from you how it was viewed in the region. And that was the recent spy balloon incident in February, which I mean, it created, considerable tension and some damage in U.S.-China relations, at least here in the near term. And it's, China has begun to escalate its anti-American rhetoric now with unprecedented language, labeling the U.S. as the culprit for containing and suppressing China's development. And after the incursion of the Chinese aircraft into U.S. airspace, the Secretary of State in the U.S. postponed his trip to China in early February. What is your general sense? And I know you didn't cover this, obviously, in the Southeast Asia survey, but what's your general sense of how countries in Southeast Asia view the balloon incident and its impact on U.S.-China relations?
On one level, the balloon incident, puts a smile on some people's faces. But on another level, it is very worrying. And I would say in Southeast Asia, the way we see Americans respond to it, it betrays something of the American psyche. And there's this kind of almost the media was falling over themselves to report about the incident. And the responses coming out of DC was sometimes bordering on maybe hysterical. On the other hand, when we looked at the Chinese response, it appeared quite measured. You may not agree with me, but it wasn't made in the same usual tone, not a pitch higher, not a pitch lower. So in the long term, what keeps policymakers awake at night, Paul? It's the idea that there could be an accidental, unintentional conflict. And this is an incident that's like a precursor. We haven't. I don't know the ins and outs of this incident, so I won't comment on that. But this is shows us that anything can happen in the air, out at sea, in the South China Sea. If anything accidental happens, then it could spark a conflict. And what's worrying is that there are no open communication lines between the two countries. We would really like to see both sides speak to each other, have closer coordination and communication. And because misunderstandings just lead to even more misunderstandings. And that's not healthy. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, the US-China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world right now. It's not Russia-Ukraine, it's not Russia-China, it's US-China. And whatever happens in that relationship is going to impact the rest of the world. And with the immediate vicinity being Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I mean, your point that it's an important relationship for the world, but in particular for this region here. The most unfortunate, I think, fallout of the spy balloon, one was that Secretary Blinken was not able to travel to China. I think both sides were looking forward to that visit to try to put some stability in the relationship in advance of what I think will be a difficult year for a variety of reasons.
Yes, and we hope that visit can still carry on, can still take place.
May be hard. That may be hard, but I think we have U.S. will be hosting APEC in the fall, and that will be an opportunity for President Xi to travel there. I think President Xi will want to go to APEC in San Francisco. I think President Biden will want to have him there, and that may be a forcing function for the two sides to find some way to put the relationship on a little bit more of a stable footing. The other unfortunate aspect of the balloon is, the debate on U.S.-China and our China policy has been quite intense in Washington, D.C. and in policy circles. And our Lao Baixing, our everyday Americans across the country hear it, but they don't have a sort of a concrete feel for it. And I think the one real downside of the balloon is that you had Americans who could look up and see a Chinese spy balloon, and that makes it real, the China threat real. And so I understand your point about it looked at times like the reaction was hysterical, but it was, I think, a concrete example for Americans to take away. And in 2019, I understand that a foreign spy balloon flew into China's national airspace as well. There's apparently a documentary film on it. And the Chinese reaction was they sent a PLA Air Force jet into the air and shot it down and gave the pilot an award for protecting China's national sovereignty. So in a sense, the Chinese reaction to the similar incident in China was very much like the reaction in the U.S., but yet the narratives now coming out of both capitals are very, very different. Chinese side, the U.S. overreacted when, in fact, the Chinese responded in a similar way. So it's really unfortunate, and we'll see what happens going forward. But I hear what you're saying is the region is concerned about the state of the relationship, and as you say, the potential for some inadvertent potentially clash or incident, and the escalation of that being difficult to manage, and the impact, the implications for the region are considerate.
Yeah, I think the risks are very high now. It's been elevated since February 2022, when the invasion of Ukraine took place, and that the divide is real. And I think it's understandable, of course, every country will respond the way it has to respond. But privately, I suppose there can be some communication, between the two sides. And doing certain things away from the spotlight, or saying certain things away from the spotlight, might be helpful to kind of, cool down the temperatures, the tensions. So that's why in this regard, whatever that both sides can do to try to, just to borrow your catchphrase, put the guardrails back in the relationship will be tremendously helpful, and make people sleep a little better here in the region.
Well, thank you for sharing your perspectives on U.S.-China. I know that's outside of the context of the Southeast Asia survey, but I very much appreciate it. And I appreciate your thoughts and explaining the state of the Southeast Asia survey and some of the findings this year. Very insightful, very much appreciate it. And we look forward to hopefully having you on again next year when the survey comes out and continuing the conversation. So thank you very much for joining the China in the World podcast, Sharon. And we hope to have you on again soon. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. I enjoyed myself. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the China in the World podcast. For more episodes and research, please go to carnegieendowment.org. This episode was produced by Nathaniel Schur with assistance from Wang Yuan Hang and Michael Malanconi. The music was composed by Spencer Barnett.